Okay, this is a slight continuation from some comments that I was making about some commentary on things that Richard Grannon has said, which I generally agree with Richard Grannon. It's just uh, oh, I have the recording goes into it, but I just wanted to kind of extend and elaborate on two themes and try to weave them into an independent sort of political point to make about the current era that we live in, which I think are themes that Richard Grannon himself is not insensitive to. But so uh, Glenn Greenwald recently made a brilliant video titled "The Bizarre Refusal to Apply Cost-Benefit Analysis to COVID Debates," and he talks about sort of this as being completely irrational but insane as well. And I want to sort of diagnose that insanity and talk about it, but also talk about how this is this is very easy to get caught up into uh, when one isn't thinking from first principles, when one isn't sort of proceeding from sort of basic values and constructing them in some kind of humble or authentic way, but it's just sort of jumping onto a bandwagon. And it this follows on from my description of the kind of thing that we are fighting against within the culture war that we need to rebel from, um, is not simple is not so simple to guard against, because and especially if you want to sort of draw this into an oversimplification of the generalization between like Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, I think that's a really horrible way to get the treatment action plan, you know, rolling. It's really going to take us to the wrong place, because we're just going to create a kind of defense mechanism, a kind of bulwark, which won't be sustainable. It won't keep its integrity. And the kind of ways in which the problem manifests is that it erodes and dissolves. Um, I mean, I gave a kind of anthropological run through of how I think that this happens even generationally, but that effectively we've got individuals in each cohort that themselves are toxic individuals. And if they can't establish a kind of counterculture, if they can't join a kind of in group, out group sort of social economy, which is the natural, let's say, procession, that occurs between generations, usually because there's usually something to criticize about the last generation. But because the 90s morality of non racialism and non sexism had it so right, and I would argue also that it was starting the true values and principles of equality that were being promulgated by the 90s morality have essentially, they were too taxing to borderline females, and their territory was being encroached upon, and essentially the lack, the poverty in our culture, the inability for females to have strong friendships and to have social bonds that aren't based on a kind of morality play, and they get vortexed into the hypergamous sexual strategy, which is a lot more. Uh, uh, I would argue that women are more vulnerable to their lowest common denominator sexual strategy than men are, because men have to earn the the status, that they have to play the game of society in order to be remunerated with female companionship, in order to be chosen. I mean, assuming, as we have for a long time, most human cultures live in a society where essentially betrothal has a very large consensual component to it. Um, or at least, and this almost marks, I'll say as well, this is also a key distinction between, let's say, the more Western mentality and or specifically the Romance philosophy and culture in society versus the more traditional, dogmatic, rule-based uh, uh, forms of societal order and structure. Um, and I'll say that in the so this is just to touch on the point of the Eastern philosophy, is that the reason why the Eastern philosophy seems to be purer and more based in the individual spiritual subjective outlook is because that's all it had. They never, like spiritual liberation was fundamentally disjointed from the, any kind of concept of the dignity of the individual in the world. That no, you don't have dignity, you have suffering. And maybe there's a kind of dignity in stoically being able to burden that in some way that sort of achieve satori or something. Although I mean I think that there are descriptions of mastery which essentially very heavily depict skating beneath and above sort of the societal structure, whereas in the West, by not relying on dogma and tradition and a kind of Confucianist template that is rigidly and dogmatically enforced, the religion of the West or the spiritual philosophy of the West eventually required all structures to substantiate themselves with reason. And you can sort of besmirch that as, oh, it's all content based, it's all trying to be so complicated. Well, I would say that that's the corruption of the Western system. That's not the true spirit of the Western spirit, as it were. True Western spirit is much more like sort of enlightenment, reason. And then obviously reason that is very poor at providing substantiation then has to sort of dress itself up as having content and substance that is actually meritorious, that actually holds water, that actually contains some kind of values that are coherent and self-consistent. And sort of the inability to test for that self-consistency under the guise of sort of intricate cerebral complexity that becomes indecipherable. That is obviously, let's say, a corruption of the whole model or a corruption of the whole fundamental structure that the system is predicated on. But I think confusing that with the West or conflating that with the identity of well, that is Western philosophy, I mean, is I think to well, I mean, first of all, it's you have to also understand intellectuals as opposed to the general thrust of society. And I think that it's a little bit unfair to judge a society by its malcontent philosophers, but it's better to sort of at least hearken to the philosophical voices that chime into at least the political philosophy. That perhaps we should actually see, well, what philosophy aligned itself with the general political framework and to have a kind of more realistic view of Western philosophy, not just to say, well, it falls under the umbrella of being generated within the territory. It's not the same thing as as if all ideas are equal, sort of thing. Is ready to concede to a kind of nihilistic, skeptical, sort of statistical reductionism. Anyway, sorry, I'm bouncing around a bit, but so I don't take the reduction between sort of the East being older and superior, and being more subjective and more yin, and the West being more yang. I mean, I don't know what perhaps could be more Confucius. What could be more yang than Confucianism? Um, in fact, I think it's actually insidiously yang. You know, if you want to think that that's kind of yin, and I think that probably the best thing that comes from Confucius thought, which is the belittling of Confucius, which he essentially admits to. And I think that if you study this, you actually see a critique in the weakness of of the sordid, the morally complicated compromise which Confucius injected into the culture, and that sits as a kind of as a polemic against the entire structure, which is called Confucius and the Old Fisherman. And the Old Fisherman is represented as a master of the Tao, and he essentially rebukes Confucius, and Confucius submits to his superior philosophy, and it's kind of like the missing morality that is not does not come to a head in the Confucius container system, if I can put it like that. And the only thing that can manifest in that container system is maybe some kind of individual liberation, which does not dare to tread on the toes of the political machinations of the collective order, which is always regarded as a kind of monolith. And because that is traditionally unchallenged and unquestioned in the East, then the wisdom of their tradition has a longer staying power. It has a momentum in it which has not been retained in the West. But as the West has digested its own mythology and history, and it has rebelled against it, but it's still in the bowel. It's not been expelled. So we're in the process of reprocessing our own waste in the West here, which on a collective scale, I would say, and this is because the religion essentially undermined itself in that it knew that it was not true Christianity. They knew that Catholicism was not true Christianity. It kind of the culture itself percolated to that self-realization. Ergo Nietzsche, God is dead, and things like that. Although I probably have a different. I think I might have a lot of agreement with Richard Grannon on that, but there are a lot of people that talk about Nietzsche, and I think I probably disagree with a lot of things that are said about Nietzsche. But anyway. So what's the point here? So I contend that Nietzsche didn't understand his own philosophy, which is why he didn't write it out. He could only transmit it through fiction and through story and through motif or whatever, because he could not derive, the stuff that was published after his death, that was sort of his edited notebook, I think is very misleading. But anyway, I'd like to sort of give him the benefit of the doubt that he was mulling over these things, and he was, trying to work out what I think even you can generate a slave morality out of the Übermensch that requires a kind of a final existential surmounting that it's important to, I think, defeat the I do think that essentially the only way to fully overcome slave morality is essentially, I've described it in other recordings. You can find in Vasti Root's on Living with Nihilism and Catherine Elgin's Epistemic Agency. Both of those things, I think, can be easily read together, and that's a perfect first philosophy, and it works. And it is the true synthesis of Nietzsche's philosophy as well. But essentially, that gives you a kind of belief in God and a belief in a kind of God, which is the true Christian God. And then, but anyway, that also requires a very particular reading of the doctrine of Christ. Anyway, but and essentially, God does a lot of work in that kind of worldview, where God is not a sky daddy, God is not a narrative. God is like the spirit of the living morality that can animate people, and that you can then commune with other people through that culture, that spiritual culture, which is an individual spirit. And the spirit of truth, the spirit of discerning, and that discerning is free to choose, and it chooses its values, and that's how it overcomes absurdism. It says, I choose, and therefore self-determinism and value itself is a kind of is a commitment which is the check is signed by your own hand, by your own epistemic agency. And the agent is therefore the author of truth, as it is the underwriter of the truth, but its criteria for truth is this morality, is the spirit of morality, which you can only subjectively claim is an objective standard, essentially. But it's not an objective standard because it's there to be seen, it's there to be heard. And it can't be perfectly rationalized in the mind. It can only be understood as something like the Platonic philosophy of ideal forms, and then it's something that you understand. And then yes, you have to admit, you have to give the devil his due, literally, and the skeptic will ask you, but why, and how do you know? And you have to say, I might be wrong, but I don't believe I'm wrong. So yes, they can force you to admit some technical shred of doubt, and then you can say, show me a better way. What are you doing? And they have nothing but their parasitism, but their pseudo-intellectualism, but their sort of demand for some kind of alternative or some kind of hidden circular reasoning that will help them square their circles, because they have the wrong questions and the wrong obstacles that they wish to surmount. They were already lost in the hypothetical winds of some future expectation or self-image that they took as their goal and their idolatry, and they're not willing to unmask that idolatry in the contradistinction of the living God and the life of truth, as it were. But these things are not objective claims; these are subjective articles of faith, essentially. But I'm also explaining how they are believed. But anyway, look, let me not get too much into sort of apologetics. But now, yeah, I mean, I can admit that there are Taoists who have had this kind of same mentality, and there are lots of people that can be quite spiritually, philosophically astute and aware and self-realized. There is a difference in politics, though. Politics is where it never gets simple. It gets very, very messy. Because I want, but it's not just that I want, but it also, perhaps I should just start off in the most humble position possible. I want a political structure that respects the dignity of the individual, But that's a bit difficult, because what happens if other people's definition of dignity is your uh, 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 is your insult, I guess. And so, we have to have something to mediate, well, what is a kind of subjective province of liberal freedom, and what is a kind of, sort of, where does dignity uh, locate itself? And I like talking about dignity more than freedom, because it becomes much more obvious that there needs to be some kind of zero sum game. There needs to be some, um, you know, you have to reach some break point, as it were, or so you have to get right up to the precipice so that you can work out what the zero sum dignity um, rules should be. And those rules can be quite conservative, in the sense that they don't have. You can try and work out, well, what is the barest minimum of rules that we need to work out, when you're crossing the dignity line and when you're not. And you can draw many different matrices to try to satisfy just that one semantic value, dignity. Without values grounding it, without sort of other rights and other uh, uh, basic philosophical commitments, you can't get anywhere with just one word. So it's this is not easy. It is complicated, and we're in this mess because people were allowed, because people are always allowed to play with language to some degree, but then they were allowed to sort of clothe those games with some kind of elite philosophical excuse of, well, radical subjectivism, radical relativism, like, and therefore I'm allowed to make, in my own rights, uh, semantic equivocation, and then impose speech codes on other people. I mean, I do think sort of the corruption of the value of freedom of speech was, what got the ball rolling in this arena of now what we see as a kind of very rabid kind of bumbling fascism. Um, and I mean, I do actually, I'm very grateful for having this whole COVID mess, because it's a wonderful petri dish to see. I mean, I do think that we can kind of see that the COVID alarmism is exactly of the same variety as the woke movement. You have a systemic crisis, you have a systemic problem, right? But then you get people that want to scapegoat it. They only want to look at one side of the ledger, as Glenn Greenwald puts it. They don't want to have a rational conversation about the costs of the lockdown, and and the disproportionate analysis, the one-sided analysis. Somehow we must just always just scapegoat and put pressure on people, and because and we have to make a kind of fake morality tests that, well, if and a fake morality play, well, if everyone just got the vaccine, then we could go back to normal. But because we haven't got 100% compliance, then we just continue. So it's like it's always just sort of deferring and diverting blame. And I think it's especially putting pressure on basic fundamental values, so it can avoid making a more holistic assessment of reality. So it can ignore its own pragmatism, and it can just divert the contrived and confected moral panic where they want it to, where they can essentially scapegoat. Sorry, I mean, I am not representing Glenn Greenwald's argument fully, but I don't want to repeat all of his content. But I'll put the link in, and I'll just take that as for granted that you've watched that. But again, like, I think that the real solution to all of this is to have our own experts. Is to have strong enough institutions with a strong enough backbone where they can actually have a few of their professors, one who's a virologist, one who's an epidemiologist, one who's a public health, sort of expert, sort of substitute down the line, or let's say conject a completely alternative public health policy and conject a completely alternative rationale, which would involve, let's say, a discourse which you don't see in our liberal democracy. And I understand that essentially the only excuse that the current mainstream really has is that public health has generally been seen as a different form of crisis, that public health is kind of dealt with on the level of a kind of existential war threat, that if you go to war you can start keeping secrets about the enemy and you can maybe indulge in propaganda, and we have indulged in a kind of propaganda around the virus, so much so that it's quite silly, but how this has been used to twist democracy and sort of spin narrative yarns, but I mean, I think that this is because, sorry, I'm perhaps giving too much of playing too much devil's advocate here, because I do think that journalism itself has bred a type of journalist who is used to scapegoating structural problems onto, heaping it onto the heads of people that they want to see suffer in their retributivistic, sort of psychopathic, sadistically edged narrative, foisting and projecting, their reality tunnel that creates this, this kind of false solution of, well, it's because we're not sacrificing the right scapegoat to the altar. And so, you can see how irresponsible journalists have been on these questions, on these matters. And in some sense, they have really entrained themselves to being kowtowed by the bandwagon of the mob think and the group morality that, the basic values in that whole institution, have just been completely eroded away. And I do think that we don't sort of fight against this by trying to create an alternative identity and saying we're this and you're not this. Although, I mean, effectively, de facto, that's maybe what I want to happen in practice. But I don't think we have to, as ordinary people, go and receive brands and badges and insignia and to prove that we're different from them. I think we just have to create certain watchdogs, institutions, and certain ratings agencies that vet certain institutions and give them gradings and give them ratings, and that we make our decisions according to that we have a filtration system so that we can essentially, that we have the experts to keep the fences maintained of the places that have gotten a clean bill of health, that they have been vetted as being not corrupted by this anti-constitutional betrayal of non-racialism and non-sexism, among other things. And I think that defending our dignity that way as well would also create a much more useful, hopefully, development of jurisprudence that can also then be used to be reflected upon and used against these journalists and these I mean, I call them bumbling fascists. I think I want to call proto-fascists to bumbling fascists, although a lot of them I think are not even that bumbling. They really are quite rabid. They are their morality and their integrity is just it's disgusting. I mean, it's you can tell that they need to be sucking the blood of some kind of scapegoat. They have to be, it's sort of like, and perhaps a lot of it is because they are themselves a kind of imposter, because they see themselves in the role that they fulfill, that they're not doing that job. They are an activist of that, occupying the seat of that profession. And so everyone must be an activist like them. Everyone must be an imposter like they are. Otherwise, if that sort of thing doesn't spread, then they can't kind of conceal their insufficient, sort of. I can't think of a good word, but a kind of just a the lack of substantiation, the lack of justification for their own worldview must gnaw at them to such an extent that the fire of their revolutionary grievance must set the whole society alight. The fire must always be growing, otherwise it's and I do think that this is a trial by fire for the rest of us, and we must take it as such, and we must and we must take that when we are burnt by it as a reflection of our own, because I think that already we should be protected. That on paper we are protected, but we haven't vindicated our constitution against this moral scourge. And until we find a way to manifest morality in a way that is principled and that protects us, then I think that our morality is not properly honed. And I mean, I say this, but I say this on the level of law, purely on the level of law itself. But at least that's the case in the South African perspective. In the rest of the rest of the world, it's not even a legal thing. It's more of a political and a cultural thing. Although obviously it's also still a political thing in South Africa, and that is a different kind of battle to fight and a different kind of gauntlet. But but at least in the rest of the world, it's more clear, at least that the solution can come without politics. It can actually come without politics. Uh, at least if you still live in a liberal society, in a liberal democratic society in which you have freedom of association and freedom of contract, that you can set up your own universities, you can set up your own, kind of private schools or with different curricula and different syllabuses, and work towards creating an independent, different system. Or at least, as I said, like a vetting agency that can go around and say which institutions are corrupt and which institutions have got safeguards in place. And I think it's developing those safeguards that is the valuable thing. It's not fighting on the ground, trying to fight fire with fire. It's vindicating the values and the principles. In the American Constitution, it's like the 14th Amendment, and the civil rights legislation, which they even have to remove to do the disgusting things that they want to do, as they distort society and create a kind of a never-ending, self-fueling, self-propelling, sort of grievance. Toxic form of sort of political. I mean, it's amazing watching people create the problem that they use to justify making the problem worse. You know, it's and then you can't say that this is stupid, because if you call it stupid, then they've got all their semantic buzzwords and loose associations of very cheap moralization and hype, and hyperbole and cherry picked sort of reality checks that are bad reality checks that help them sort of act like comedians, because they can't even debate their point, they can't substantiate it, they just have to kind of scoff at that anyone might even dare to disagree with them, because they don't even try to establish anything, they just assert their worldview as if it is a fact. They don't anyway, it's very sad, but okay, so yeah, sorry, I'm drifting so far from the thesis that I wanted to talk about. So, the thing that I just wanted to say between the West and the East is that the West applied reason against its own traditions, and it never fell into dogma, but it does lose sight of its own basic values, whereas the East never lost sight of its traditions, as it were, and its containers. And those structures, although then it's very easy to kind of spiritually debase them, which is a useful stepping stone to, let's say, unlocking your own mind, is kind of debunking the collective narrative and societal, kind of fabric and coercion, and seeing through it. And that's perhaps harder to do in the West, because the West has a kind of a mixing of values and political structure, whereas you can't really make that mistake in the East. And I mean, even in so-called democratic societies in the East, sort of Japan and South Korea, you have to know the difference between the technical political structure and the actual political philosophy and culture of a society. These cultures are not liberal democracies. They might technically count as liberal democracies, but their cultures are not liberal democracies. Their cultures are state sovereign. They believe in state sovereignty. The Japanese government is treated with a reverence that is not the same as the emperor back in those days, but it's also not. I mean, you just look at how the Japanese government is treated by its own population, which keeps on buying Japanese bonds which should never be bought, but they are funded by the population, because there's a tradition of state sovereignty. We don't have that kind of tradition in the West, and we are actually better for it. And it makes things more messy, because it means that, and you say that we're a younger culture and they're an older culture. There is some truth in that. We're young in the sense that it's all happening in front of us. It's all before us. When I say before us, I mean before our eyes. It's happening in real time. It's all happening in real time. And yes, we can remember things that we've forgotten and we bring them back into the real time. But it's happening in the tumult of the present. Whereas there is this structural continuity in the East. Again, I think that these kinds of things are apples and oranges, and to sort of sorry, okay, and let me go back and make the point that I poorly made. is that what is it? The issue about it's the issue about what is it that the, about politics being not simple and that it's complicated is that the dignity of the individual has to share the state. Now that's a big question. How does an individual that wants to see themselves as a sovereign, in a spiritual creditor, a kind of self-ownership, self-determinism, dignity of the individual, how does such a powerful being, powerful in its own mind, in its own subjective mind, how does that share a state? How does that share some kind of political edifice, some kind of political structure with other people who want the same? Now, I mean, the short answer is liberal political philosophy. And knowing that liberal political philosophy doesn't give you your actual core worldview, it just gives you a way of relating to your society. It gives you a container. It doesn't tell you what's inside of that container. It maybe suggests as to the dignity inside that container. And then, we have, I think, grown in the West this idea that obviously if you want to play identity politics, if you want to play grievance games, if you want to be like the Nazis even were, don't give us liberal democracy, give us what we deserve as our identity, tell us what we deserve and bestow it on us, and we'll choose the best father figure, we'll choose the best Führer, we'll choose the best authoritarian that will be a mediator on our behalf, in our interests. Give us that instead. And obviously to do that, you have to already devalue what's in the container, as it were. And so this is the problem, is that liberal democracy can kind of promote the container, but it doesn't have, let's say, the thing like the religious value. It doesn't simultaneously say, well, go be a Christian or go believe in the sovereignty of the self-determinism. It's more like, we're silent on that. That's your prerogative. That's your journey. You're an individual. And there's a bit of a kind of, let's say, there's a structural inconsistency to that, but there's a deeper philosophical coherence in that, when things are going right. When you actually have a society that maybe one of the most important things is a functioning economy. Because if you have a completely dysfunctional economy that, for example, in South Africa already only moves according to racialist mandates and racialist designated beneficiaries of policy, then you've already got a kind of toxic, sort of you don't have a model of the way of the world, as it were. You don't have a structural model of how you're actually supposed to use the system and grow your sovereignty and your self-determinism and your ability and self-empowerment. That gets replaced with the empowerment of some toxic identitarian consciousness, or some toxic, this is the fate of how, so having an economy that has small and medium businesses and vibrant entrepreneurial class, which can never thrive in a system that has a lot of mandates, and a system that has sort of so much red tape that only large corporations can absorb those kinds of costs, and that can pay the premium on, headhunting token and imposters to help them fulfill whatever criteria they need for a certain governmental, sort of thing, or just the general wastage in business, having to pay some politically connected black elite so that they can have the credential of having so much black ownership in the deal, never mind, that all that money is essentially just being passed, that cost is being passed on to the consumer, and the people who are actually doing the work is just being subcontracted, or it's coming from an export from a foreign economy. So it adds nothing to the local economy, it just adds another corrupt cost of corruption to the system, but it's not corruption to the law, because this is how the law currently operates in South Africa. It's a moral corruption, and it's also a betrayal of the fundamental values of the Constitution. But anyway, so these things should have been declared as unconstitutional and ruled unlawful on that basis, but they have not, because the law has been institutionally corrupted. But that's a problem then, because then you really have to make a moral campaign, a moral movement, a moral education, and you have to kind of perhaps angle for a kind of civics education, but also an education in something like morality and democratic literacy, which has also taken a huge knock from these journalists and these just the dysfunction of the economy itself distorts the political lens. That they have literally created the problem that they use as an excuse to worsen and receive more political control and power. And it's sorry, I stated it better before. It is the self-fueling prophecy, the self-fulfilling failure that generates its own exacerbation. So, what else? So secular morality is something that I think, there should be a civics education. There should be a civics education that explains, sort of what the state does, and policy choices, and the differences between different ideologies, and also, or at least teach the controversy over the Constitution, if you're not going to at least teach the proper values of the Constitution. But I think, it's very hard to read the Constitution without realizing just how badly it's been betrayed by its own constitutional court, just how badly Section 1 values of non-racialism have been relegated to a political football for the ANC to use to disguise its corruption, and for the courts to say, we're not going to constitutionally test this legislation, it's the governmental prerogative, when there is simply no excuse for such a thing in South African law. It's utterly disgusting. And so, again, my whole thing is are the people strong enough to resurrect the new South Africa, because it has already been murdered and betrayed, and the spirit of which is on the ropes, as it were. And you can't even get proper coverage of the moral polemic, but I also feel that the moral polemic is not perhaps being driven hard enough, and for it to be echoed in different corners, because that is what is needed at some point. People have to start talking the same values, the same moral language, so people know, yes, this is the polemic of our time, and it has not even, we have not made a fence of it yet. We need to erect a fence and man the fence and guard the fence, and I mean that in terms of the culture, but in terms of the morality about the culture, and then we need reflections of that in institutional filtering, and as I say, like ratings agencies that say, well, this corporation gets this mark because it's wading into political morality, it's making virtue signals, and they're not promoting non-racialism, they're promoting identity politics, they're promoting bumbling fascism. And we need to work out how to derive this into maybe some educational modules, but also some basic criteria that we can create a system where you can pull these things apart, and you can deconstruct them as being eminently unconstitutional and propaganda for constitutional damages and for undermining constitutional values, which everyone in South Africa has a duty to uphold and respect the supremacy of the Constitution. And academic freedom be damned, these race and gender studies deserve the same treatment as was given the Nuremberg prisoners in the Nuremberg trials for orchestrating the travesties, because this is a crime against humanity. Never before have we actually had explicitly a constitution that fixed all the problems. This is a different kind of crime against humanity. This is, I rank this in moral terms in the same league as genocide, because this is the ideology being promulgated that is the thing that is the precursor to an actual genocide as well. And we have to start understanding that morality has consequences. Morality is a kind of destiny. And that the state corruption in this country is a direct parallel to the moral corruption. I didn't make the point about genocide perhaps elegantly enough, but have to probably fill in all the missing claims that such a syllogism would require. But I guess this has to do with the sense of even apartheid was not defeated once, it was defeated twice. It was first defeated in the mind, and then it was defeated on the ground of action and negotiation, etc., etc. But it was first defeated morally and ideologically, and that morality was non-racialism, and it has been murdered, it has been betrayed, strategically, tactically, and cynically. And the amount of times that you see Julius Malema and Zuma talk about the same topic with reversed opinions, with no, the flip-flopping, the utter, it's just the constant stream of opportunistic rattling the cage of some kind of moral panic, of instilling this contrived and confected moral emergency, so that they get to define what the moral emergency is, so that they get to talk over and grandstand and malign anyone who does not agree with them. This is the tool of the authoritarian and the scapegoat, and the sort of the bandwagon scapegoat, which is always the disguise for corruption. Because when you have that kind of power to delude people by merely concocting in us versus them simplicity. It's but it all comes from these journalists as well that create these fake morality tests that have supported that kind of irresponsible, morally reprehensible, racialist filth. The pseudo-intellectual garbage, which they don't even bother to try to substantiate because they can't. They simply just say, well, the numbers don't add up, or they make some statistical comparison as if they've made a moral argument, as if they've made a moral claim, except just describing something from a very cherry-picked, a very morally bankrupt, kind of virtue signaling, blind faith. All they can do is table thump. All they can do is repeat themselves. The statistic, or something, some arbitrary factoid. Never mind where did that factoid come from, or then now you have to play Inspector. You have to play Sherlock Holmes for each shred of chaff that they have thrown up to disguise their unaccountable moral position, of externalizing the blame, of systematizing blame onto a scapegoat. Sorry, I've been rambling on for quite a bit, but let me just say that this is the problem that I have with Richard Grannon's a bit of an oversimplification, is that you end up doing the same thing. That you end up systematizing it and falsely reducing the problem into just, this is this new condition and it's having this effect. No, I don't buy any of that. It's not the condition that's having the effect. I mean, it's happening within the condition, maybe. It's happening through the auspices, or, through... But the actual thing that's happening is the morality, is the corruption of the morality. And that's also leads to, I think, was quite a good argument that I made in my last recording. How did the argument go? It was something like that it's not social media that's the problem, it's the curatorship aspect of it. And I went into that on like a semi-psychological kind of analysis, but or as a kind of moral, spiritual philosophy kind of analysis as well. But I think that's really what it's all about. And I don't think that we should get into the war of trying to scapegoat excuses and things like that. And I mean, you can see it in COVID especially, and I mean, I can understand if you went against the COVID narrative, you get politically crucified. If you're a political party and you wanted to stick your head above the parapet, it would get lobbed off. You'd get shot. So I can tolerate some sort of realism on those kinds of things, but at the end of the day, I mean, let me just tell you what my view of COVID is eradication is not possible, because this virus is going to have an animal reservoir, and you can't, and even fighting it with a vaccine is a terrible idea. There's a reason why we've never developed COVID vaccines before. It's because COVID mutates way too quickly. This is all medical experimentation. It's a bad idea. Yes, a lot of people are dying and all that kind of stuff, but this is still, I would not rank this as a deadly virus. A deadly virus is one that kills children at the same level at which it kills old people. This virus is not a deadly flu. It does not kill children at the same rate that it kills old people. It's killing sick people and killing old people. Like, if you want to have a vaccine and you want to give it to old people, that sounds great. That sounds like a good idea. I don't think necessarily we should even be giving it to people that haven't had all the children that they plan on having and things like that. I mean, we really don't know what we're doing at all. But also, it's probably for naught in terms of the long term, because it's just going to mutate. I mean, Australia thought it was so clever when it eradicated the virus. But they really just condemned themselves to never being able to open up to the rest of the world in perpetuity, unless the rest of the world could eradicate the virus, which was never on the cards. That was just never going to be possible. And it's funny because once they started injecting people with the vaccine, now suddenly you got a lot of cases of COVID, and I actually suspect that those stories of outbreak having to do with airports, I think that those are in fact lies. I think that once you start giving vaccines to people start getting the virus, not the people that got the vaccines, but the people around them. Because I think that the vaccine can make you obviously less infectious, but I think that you are a little bit I mean, this is what happens with vaccines. People get mumps from other people who haven't. People that have gotten the mumps vaccine get mumps. Give mumps to people that didn't get the mumps vaccine. Did you know that? That happens with vaccines. So conveniently, Australia had eradicated the virus. They start vaccinating people. Suddenly, the virus exists in their country, and suddenly they got stories that it comes from airports. Anyway, okay, that's maybe I sound like a conspiracy theorist, so maybe just put that to one side. But I mean, it's do we really actually want to live in a world without flus that kill old people? I think that that's bad for public health. If we eradicated all of these diseases, it would be very dangerous for our society, because that means that when we do have an outbreak of something, it's going to kill everyone potentially. It's going to kill the young and the old. Right now, we've always lived symbiotically. Our public health has always lived symbiotically with these flus that have always killed a lot of people, and they have always been old, and they have always been immunocompromised. And that has been somewhat a fact of life and somewhat a fact of public health. And I mean, these are horribly crude things to say, but they're also somewhat reality. And the kind of idea that you can just kind of scapegoat reality onto a group of people that aren't doing what some lowest common denominator, simplistic so-called solution that's been blared on the speakerphone and that's been repeated so many times but not been properly substantiated, where the debate has been suppressed, where there has been no honest, rational exchange about this, that hasn't been filtered. I mean, it's it's embarrassing. I mean, this is, you would think that we live in China. But that is how politics has been going, and I'll put that at the feet of the journalists that have created this kind of political narrative arena. It's because they don't have any moral integrity. The talk radio hosts, they belong to the mob, essentially. They morality has been subverted and is dominated for them by some kind of fashion, just because there are enough people in white lab coats, or the Nazis had the academics of their time, feeding them Darwinistic theories. Now we've got our race and gender studies from our academia giving moral support. Rabidly promoting and making the way straight for these bumbling fascists to get away with their horse trading and calculations. What also hasn't been spoken about is if the kind of resilience or immunity that the vaccine confers is not perhaps detrimental long term for other variants. We don't even know that. It might condition the immune system to be vulnerable later on to other things. Now, I know that that's pure speculation, but that's also pure speculation which cannot just be dismissed out of hand because there's no evidence, because we have no experience, we have no long-term studies of these things. And this kind of medical experimentation is, quite frankly, it's probably not worth it, considering that there were alternative treatments. But all of these factoids are taboo subjects because they exist contrary to the mainstream narrative and message and enforced orthodoxy. And if we don't get 100% vaccination, then it's because of people like me who didn't jump on the bandwagon. That's how this whole woke movement operates. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And it's also the same thing that I was trying to criticize about Richard Grannon, about the kind of the oversimplification of the issue. Although, ironically, I guess. Look, I don't know all of the points he was actually making, because I believe that the whole thing was slightly cryptic. And I did actually watch most of it, but I didn't watch all of it because I kind of skipped through the 2-hour podcast. And I mean, I could extract some things from that, 2 things, which I don't know, maybe if they're intended or not. The one thing is that, well, don't talk about it. Like, don't directly talk about the culture war. Just say what you want to say. Just use different words. Like, get your point across, and just kind of, slightly step around their trigger words. But don't edit what you want to say. Just find like a slightly different way of saying it. And what was the other idea that I had? Like, just sort of don't step in their booby-trapped vocab. Sort of don't step directly on their buzzwords. one other. I guess that was the other thing, is just not addressing it and moving on with your life in some sense, like just sort of operating beyond it and leaving them to languish in it, sort of thing. Not addressing it directly, addressing it indirectly in that way. But yeah, I think socially that is how we should operate, but I think that somewhat institutionally and politically, and I mean, look, I'm not saying that, I think Grannon has already made, in his rebellion video, I think he makes this point about standing up against it and taking some heat for it, or and such. So I don't think I'm contradicting him or that he's contradicting me in what I'm about to say. It's just that I think that it's better to work smart than hard on these problems, and I think that the smart thing is to minimize conflict, is not to not stand up, but when I say minimize contact, I mean work for the long-term solution, and which does require perhaps more coordination, more organization, but potentially I think funding watchdogs and getting people to specifically stand as a standard bearer, and I mean that as a pun, I guess, that a standard bearer for the values, but also specifically how those values translate into a particular field of a particular profession or industry or institution, so that you can essentially, but that also is focused around also trying to establish model institutions that have successfully filtered out the bad thing, so that it's not just there to say you're good and you're bad and to sort out the good from the bad, but also to give tools and promote the good and be the toolkit and be the instrument, and to be the, let's say, the think tank about how you would establish cleaning it up. So then at least then there's a model that people can follow, and then when people are in business and they're getting heat from someone, they can say, I'm going to phone this watchdog because they've got a lawyer on their, they know the lawyer that can defend this case. They have the experts lined up. They have the ducks in a row. They have the intellectual infrastructure to back up the more cultural movement, as it were, to be the wind in the sails of the cultural movement, which is not there to aggravate, which is not there to make war on the streets or to make a heated culture war, is there to say, we're not interested in having a culture war, we're interested in enjoying the victory that we had in 1994, the democratic revolution. That's what we're interested in. We want what we already won, and we just are now in the process of organizing it and pragmatically ensuring its survival, or trying to sort of have it unmolested. That we would like to involve ourselves in institutions. We would like to send our children to school that are unfucked from critical race theory. That we would like to send our children to universities that aren't fucked up in this corrupt morality and disgusting ideology of a proto-fascist moral perversion that are part of this kind of this core of bumbling fascists, and kind of hollow pseudo-intellectuals of the rabid sort that flag on and make the way straight for these overt fascistic authoritarianism. authoritarians. Anyway, okay, I guess that's. I mean, I keep on centering this in kind of that's my model for the actual solution, and then I think and then I think it is as simple as whatever that cryptic video was trying to show, is that you can just kind of, you can talk about, maybe someone can correct me, that's my takeaway, is that you can talk about it without having to get heated about it. You can, don't feel like you're confronting it in talking about it. You know, you can just kind of share an understanding about it, but don't try to directly engage with it, because it'll just take you down to its level, kind of thing. And don't try to create an opposing identity to it. Although I can understand that I might sound hypocritical on that level, because I want to create a filtration system and then sort of be able to watch that filtration system very closely, so that I can know which places are better to frequent, which institutions I should, kind of avoid, or if I can have a choice between a place that has these values and a place that doesn't have these values. And that way, I think that the Constitution can be resurrected, because the judges aren't vindicating it. The judges have institutionally corrupted the law, quite sadly. I still don't know how that's going to get unfucked. I don't. We need a kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or we need a Nuremberg trial, is what we need, where we get rid of this corrupt lot.